to a guest we just love having on, EJ Antoni. EJ, welcome back to the Conservative Voice on WWDB AM 860.
Oh, thank you for having me again.
We're glad to have you, and it's somewhat like this conversation we just had with David Blackman. It feels to me like America is confused. There's so much noise out there. I mean, stuff on the social media platforms that's just fake, large corporate media platforms that have a political agenda. They're trying to run, through the, use the economy to advance. I just think people are confused. And so I think there's some bad news and I think there's some good news. And we just would like to get your thoughts. Where do things stand? What do you see happening in the economy right now?
I think that's a really good way to put it, that it's a mixed bag, right? It's not all good. It's not all terrible. Both sides have their own, let's say, sycophants that are trying to spin everything to just fit their own individual political narrative. But of course, the truth never abides by a political narrative. It just stands alone. Today's jobs report, I think, is a very good example of that. And forgive me if you guys have already discussed that report.
No, we saved it for you.
Sure,
Yes.
So it was a great headline number. That's very, very positive to see us add so many jobs in a single month. Great news there. It's also 172,000 jobs, right? It's also great to see over 90,000 in terms of the revisions. So that means that we actually had more jobs in previous months than we thought we did. So the total increase in jobs between, again, both the month over month and then those revisions is over 260,000. That's great. On top of that, the survey of households shows that the number of people employed, which is different from the number of jobs that we get from the survey of businesses, but the employment level actually rose by 99,000 last month. That's the first positive month for the employment level this year. So it's good to see that turnaround as well. So again, a lot of really positive developments in this report. And then there's some news in there that frankly is not that great. For example, all of the job growth on net, at least, was part-time work. So full-time jobs actually declined month over month. That's not to say nobody got a full-time job. Sure,
right.
Some people did, but more lost, right? So on net, there was actually a reduction in full-time work. All of the job growth looks like it was part-time. So again, it's not all great. It's not all terrible. It's very much a mixed bag. Same thing when we look at wages, right? We actually saw strong wage growth, but because prices rose so much faster, obviously these are price estimates. We won't get the official data, inflation data, until next week. But the estimates that we have right now indicate that prices rose faster than earnings did. So yes, people's weekly paycheck on average got bigger, but it bought less than the previous month.
Well, and since you turned us on to Trueflation, I've been tracking that frequently, and Trueflation you can follow on X. Everybody, it aggregates a lot of economic indicators and gives real-time data, and I think it's more accurate than what we get from the government. But it's showing inflation, I think, right now at like 1.9%. So prices are rising, but they're not rising at the level they were 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah, part of the difficulty here is the fact that when we look at the CPI, the government's inflation metric, the Consumer Price Index, is that it just doesn't measure certain things in a very timely manner. Right. And when you have something like housing, that previously the cost of housing was increasing at a very steady rate over a long period of time, well, in that case, it actually didn't technically matter if you were measuring this month's change in the cost of home ownership. Because if this month's change in the cost of home ownership was exactly the same as the change 6 months ago, then if you're measuring one or the other, it ends up having the exact same effect on your cost of living index, right? Well, that was what we dealt with for a very long time, but that's not the case right now. For example, we were throughout much of 2025 still dealing with the cost increases from 2024 that were still bleeding into the index because of how this thing is calculated.
Yep.
So what we're looking at right now does not fully capture the fact that rents in many major metropolitan areas around the country, like Dallas, like Austin, like Phoenix, like Tampa, like Miami, a lot of rental prices in those communities have actually been falling in recent months. So not just rising slower, but in outright declines. The statistics we get from BLS do not capture that at all. They are still showing increases, whereas Trueflation, that you rightly brought up, is actually measuring those prices in real time. The Bureau of Labor Statistics measures a few thousand prices 3 times a month is basically how they do it. Trueflation measures millions of prices every single day. So the law of large numbers is clearly on Trueflation's side.
Well, and that's so I looked at that because for years we looked at numbers coming out of BLS, the inflation number and the employment numbers.
They never made sense.
They never made sense. And you just mentioned that the job numbers were revised up. It's normal that they're going to be revised. But for years, we saw massive downward revisions because the numbers they were putting up when they first issued, I believe, were fake and politically motivated. Now, you may not agree with that, but that's the way I saw it. I mean, you can't just be...
Well, that's what it looked like.
Yeah.
Right?
How could you be wrong at that level year after year after year, constantly downward adjusting and then continuously coming out wrong? They were trying to give an impression that the economy was and the jobs market was much different than it was. I think we're in the different setup now. I'm not talking about the minor adjustments. I don't think they were that big. Maybe they were. But I mean that this picture that's being drawn of the economy is actually worse than things are, it seems to me. And so when you see this 1.9% inflation number, that's not what I think people believe inflation is. I think they think it's much higher than that.
Oh, yeah.
You agree with that?
Well, but I think the reason for that is, and this is part of the reason why even during the Biden years, people said we feel like inflation is way worse than the official metrics are. Like when inflation started coming down, people still said it feels like things are getting worse.
Right.
It's because we're not coming at the current situation after 4 years of a rip-roaring economy and real wage growth being positive. No, it's been negative, and the economy has not been doing great. It's been anemic. I mean, how many times have we talked about the fact that a disproportionate number of the jobs being created after the pandemic were not going to native-born Americans; they were going to foreign-born workers, right?
Yep.
And so what I'm getting at here is this. It's the fact that people were already strapped before the Iran war started. Yes, things were getting better. We were crawling out of the hole, so to speak, but we were still in the hole. A lot of families were still living paycheck to paycheck. Their monthly budget was extremely tight. They were still buried in a lot of credit card debt, and it was going to take some time to get out from under that. And now what has happened is you've had an oil shock, and you've had the price increases that predictably follow because of that. And so it's hitting people at a very vulnerable time. It doesn't have to be as bad as the price increases that we saw under Biden for it to hurt just as much because people were in a vulnerable position to begin with.
Yeah. Well, and the oil price. Okay, so we just went through this really, I thought, helpful conversation with an oil expert, David Blackman. And I'm looking at the numbers right now, and it looks like crude oil's at about, that WTI is around 90, and Brent's about 93. But we had experts telling us 2 weeks ago it was going to be at 160 by now.
So much for the experts.
So, yeah, the same experts that told it. Never mind, I'm not going to inject your kids. So look at it, okay, where we are now. Now let's think about where we go from here. If this problem in the Strait of Hormuz, if this war continues on for some time, we're going to start having really serious disruptions in some economies because they just simply won't be able to get the oil they want. We talked about the difference between price and availability with David Blackman, and we're going to probably have most of the oil, most of the products we need in the U.S., but some places like China are far more vulnerable to not having oil. Can you help us understand what you see coming if the war ends soon or if it extends? Where do we go?
Well, I remember distinctly back in March, we had a conversation, and I pointed out, do not pay attention to the folks who are saying, I know oil is going to be 60 or I know oil is going to be 160 by a certain date, because nobody knows.
Right.
Nobody knows how long this conflict is going to go for, right? Nobody knows what Trump is going to do. Nobody knows what Iran is going to do. Nobody knows what Israel is going to do. Nobody knows. So stop listening to the people who tell you that they know, okay? Nobody knows. Now, what we can answer are questions like what you just asked, which is, if the war ends soon, what's going to happen? If the war keeps going, what's going to happen? Okay, then the crystal ball is a lot less cloudy. So if this continues dragging on, what's been happening right now is we have been going through all kinds of extraordinary measures in order to reduce the impact of this supply shock. We've been burning through the Strategic Petroleum Reserve as well as private oil stockpiles. We have been skipping maintenance at our refineries in order to run them at over 95% capacity. So essentially, they're running full tilt. Now, all of these are things that are going to have to be undone in the future, right? You are increasingly refining oil in such a way so as to get more of certain fractions like gasoline, like jet fuel, like diesel, and less of others. And again, that means you're going to be starting to run short on those other fractions, on those other oil products. All of that has to get undone in the future. All that to say, once the Strait gets opened back up, once the oil starts to flow out of the Persian Gulf again, it's going to take many months before things get back to quote unquote normal. All of those oil stocks are going to have to be replenished. All of this refinery maintenance, this delayed maintenance, is eventually going to have to happen. So you will see a continuation of not only heightened demand to refill what's been emptied, but also you're going to see some different supply crunches here and there. It's going to be spread out, but it will happen over time in order to, again, undo what we've had to do so far. So this idea that somehow oil is going to get right back down to 60 or even 70 in short order, I just don't see that happening. So that's the best case scenario, even if things unwind very, very quickly. You're also going to have to deal with a lot of different supply shocks. It's been talked a lot about things like helium, how that's affected semiconductor production. We saw during the pandemic how when you have a shortage of semiconductors, countless other industries are going to be affected. That's one of the reasons why we had a car and truck shortage for so many months. It was that automakers couldn't get their hands on the chips they needed to put into their cars. That's going to continue to happen, and it's going to hit a lot of different industries. Right now, the chip shortage is not as bad as it was back then, but there still is a shortage. So if nothing else, you'll probably see some price increases. You're going to see the same thing with a lot of other industries like copper. The sulfuric acid industry, that production has been hit pretty hard. That's going to affect mining and production of copper. So there are countless examples just like that. The plastics industry is another one. So again, best case scenario here, oil gets returned to normal relatively quickly, but you still have to deal with a lot of fallout from that. The much worst case scenario is if the status quo just remains. If that's the case, if you're not getting any oil out of the Gulf, you're going to start to see not just production, but you're going to actually start to see infrastructure really impacted. What I mean by that is one of the ways we've been dealing with this supply shortage is allowing the supply chain to just really get leaned out. You can see this at the Cushing, Oklahoma facility, where they've allowed oil in storage there to go really, really low. The problem is if it goes much lower than what it is right now, you will start to see deliveries have to get canceled because you're dealing with massive oil infrastructure, right? And the way it operates is they always have a certain amount in these tanks to ensure that that they can essentially pump out for the next delivery and not run dry before the next set of incoming oil actually hits those tanks. If you thin out the supply chain much more, you will actually start to get into positions where those tanks run dry and where you actually have to pause the oil that's in pipelines. That is going to be incredibly disruptive. And that's where I think you'll start to see things like shortages of jet fuel and airlines having to cancel flights. Now, that doesn't happen instantaneously, right? Again, there's incredibly long lags here. So let's say if we go another month here and you do start actually running dry at some facilities, it may be another month before you start seeing shortages of things like jet fuel. But at that point, it's baked into the cake.
Mm-hmm. And right. Okay. So that all makes sense. And we have to remember that we're down somewhere between 8 and 10 million barrels a day, according to David. I've heard some others say it's maybe as much as 12. You can do the math a bunch of ways, but we do have increasing supply coming from other locations. It's going to further mitigate this. It's going to be tough if this war in Iran doesn't get solved soon. But people solve problems, and they're working now to find new sources, new pathways. If China has to do something to redirect oil flows from their natural path, where the logistics and the infrastructure sort of naturally would have oil from one place go to be processed. If China has to pay to do that, they're going to have to pay really big prices, or not. I mean, is that you think that makes sense?
Oh, certainly. But the problem is it's not just China, it's everybody.
Right.
I would love it if the Chinese Communist Party were the only people being hurt right now. And unfortunately, it's the rest of us. Look, here's the other really big problem that a lot of people have not yet acknowledged. When we're talking about the oil industry, and I know we've mentioned this before, you can't turn these pieces of equipment on and off like a light switch, right?
Right.
And you have to ask, why are the drillers in places like Texas not going gangbusters right now? It's because it's not easy to start and stop a well. It's because when you're thinking about pumping, you're not just thinking about, is this well productive today at 90-something dollar WTI?
Right.
You're looking at a year from now, 5, 10 years from now. And the problem is everybody's anticipating that the Strait of Hormuz is going to get opened up at least within the next few months, at least by the end of the year, and that the oil is going to be flowing again. Well, at that point, you're probably looking at oil in the 70s or 80s very, very easily.
Yep.
Now, the issue there is if I'm going to start drilling and pumping a well today that's profitable at 90, that means in a few months it's no longer profitable, except that it takes sometimes a year to just break even on the darn thing.
Right.
So that's why you're not seeing the huge increase in supply that a lot of people have been expecting and are for some reason calling on drillers to do, as if it's some kind of moral imperative that they pump oil and do so at a loss.
Yeah. Getting a well drilled, getting it to completion, getting it to production, getting that to be collected, all that infrastructure investment, it's not a simple thing. So that makes sense. Let me ask you, one of the markets that everybody was concerned about as we came into and out of the spring was the fertilizer market, because obviously we're dependent upon some things coming out of the Middle East in order to keep our fertilizer stocks up around the world. And there's obviously a higher price for fertilizer now, but a lot of the United States farmers had their fertilizer laid in. I suspect they did in other parts of the Northern Hemisphere. Are we looking at severe food disruptions as we head into 27? Is the fertilizer industry going to be so disruptive it's a problem? We've got about 4 minutes left. Where do you think we are for food in 27? Is it how bad is this going to get?
It'll be more expensive, hands down. Now, that's not to say anybody in America is going to be starving, right? I don't want to be hyperbolic here.
Mm-hmm.
When food gets more expensive in America, we grumble, we gripe, maybe we have to put it on a credit card and go into debt, but you're not starving.
Mm-hmm.
If you go to other parts of the world, some parts of East Asia, some parts of sub-Saharan Africa, they literally just don't have the money and they don't have access to additional credit. So sometimes for those folks, when food prices go up, it actually does mean people starve. But if you just want to just focus on here at home, again, this is when we're talking about the infrastructure that produces fertilizer, this is stuff that is usually running near capacity anyway. It's not as if you shut it all down for a year and then next year you can just make twice as much. No, the factories just aren't capable of churning that out. So you've definitely lost some. You've lost some of the inputs, which means you've lost some production this year. Now you're right. A lot of American farmers either already had the fertilizer in the ground or they already had it in storage. It was already purchased.
Mm-hmm.
So for those folks, it's not going to affect the current batch of crops directly, but if you're a farmer and you know that your next round of fertilizer is going to be extraordinarily expensive because there's less of it available, right now, 9 out of 10 American farmers have not been able to order as much fertilizer as they wanted to. That should tell you something.
Yep.
I think it is going to definitely continue to put upward pressure on food prices well into the future. Absolutely.
You know, and it's if you look at some industries that are commodity driven, a lot of times you'll see that as a market declines, companies create a lot of cash flow because they're selling for lower prices, but they're liquidating their inventories, they're tightening things up, they cut expenses, and they generate some cash. But then the market turns and starts to increase and costs get higher, and they don't have the credit, they don't have the asset base to go borrow. You could end up in a situation where the farmers will, in a lot of places, or certainly around the world, will have trouble just getting the credit to buy the product they need. And when I think about a place like India, this for someone like India, who I think is heavily dependent upon imported materials, I think this could be really brutal there. Is that legitimate?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, no, it's a very, very real concern. Absolutely. And again, unfortunately, so much of what we're looking at now, when we work our way through the supply chain data, whether it's the stuff from S&P Global or it's the stuff from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York or a handful of others, it's very, very clear that a lot of this is at this point, it's just baked into the cake.
Yep.
Right. There's nothing you're going to be able to do to mitigate it, unfortunately. And the only thing you can mitigate is the additional damage. In other words, don't add insult to injury. The quicker this war in Iran wraps up and the quicker we get the oil and natural gas markets back to normal, the faster the fertilizer market will eventually get back to normal too.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that for everybody around the world, this war needs to come to an end. And this is one of the points I made earlier that Iran isn't standing there with a huge number of allies that are helping it. They don't have a lot of folks saying, hey, you keep that locked down, keep that Strait of Hormuz down so you can have a nuclear weapon. It just isn't that. If China wanted them to have a nuclear weapon, they'd have it now. So it is my theory, unproven, can't say it's true, that there's a tremendous amount of international pressure, and it's going to build as we get closer to a problem in China for actual availability of oil supply. And as we get closer to seeing what's happening in the agricultural sector and with helium, there's going to be a tremendous amount of global pressure on them. EJ, we've got about 1 minute left. So is there some other point that we haven't touched on that you see as like really insightful right now, something I've missed?
Regarding Iran?
Well, whatever's happening. I mean, we see just turbulence and people are very confused. What's your final point?
I think it really goes back to the number one thing that I've been tracking, and I tracked throughout the Biden years, and I'm just kind of a dog on a bone here, is what the average American's weekly paycheck can buy. That's the number one thing to focus at and look at. It's headed in the wrong direction right now. Hopefully we get that reversed very, very soon.
Very good.